Okay, welcome back, everyone. This is our third installment of our World War One series on the history of World War One. We've already spoken about its causes and you know how the war escalated from an assassination to all-out global conflict in a span of roughly about a month and a half. We talked about the belligerents that were involved in this war. Now we're going to take a particular focus on the American experience in World War One. So let's take a look at this slide at first. Over there, the U.S. enters World War One, April 1917 to November 1918, and perhaps you could tell from the very beginning, um, there's a difference in time. The war starts in August of 1914, and yet the United States does not enter the war until April of 1917. That's a significant amount of time. So what was the United States doing in the time being? Well, the official position of the United States was neutrality. The United States was neutral and did not care to get involved in the war in Europe. The common attitude was that's those Europeans, that's European history. Those people are always fighting. And there's no good reason to send American boys to Europe to fight in yet another European war. I mean, people looked at Europe back then a little bit differently than they look at Europe today. Woodrow Wilson is in the White House, continuing, although a Democrat, the progressive legacy that started with Theodore Roosevelt. That doesn't mean progressives were not hawkish, that they were not aggressive in their foreign policy. They absolutely were. The first 4 years of Woodrow Wilson, he had no problems um, sending troops to the Dominican Republic, sending troops to Haiti, interfering in the Mexican Revolution slash Civil War, taking sides, taking the port of Veracruz, um, even threatening a potential war with Mexico. Our relationship with Mexico was not very good at this time. Pancho Villa, as a reaction to Woodrow Wilson's siding with the Carranza government, uh, actually invades the United States. Woodrow Wilson sends the American Expeditionary Force under the command of General John J. Pershing to go look for Pancho Villa, and it never does happen. So let's first start with step one. The relationship between the United States and Mexico was a very tense one at this time. It was a very tense one at this time. Um, yeah, and Mexico itself fighting its own internal battles, trying to consolidate the country under one government, the Carranza government. Yes, was in order to check and counter American influence that did not seem to be uh, very pro um, some individuals in the Mexican government, antagonistic towards Mexico. Yeah, Mexico did flirt with Germany and did purchase German weapons, and there was a concern from the United States that Germany was trying to expand its influence in the Americas through Mexico. But that's a side note. So that's the context that we fight. And for 4 years, Woodrow Wilson makes it very clear the United States will not enter the war against Europe. Makes this very clear. And even when he's up for re-election, okay, when he's up for re-election in 1916, he runs on that campaign slogan, he kept us out of the war. That means he courted the American vote in part by celebrating the fact that he had been able to successfully keep the United States out of the war. That said, how neutral was our neutrality? Wars are expensive. The belligerents in Europe eventually ran out of money, and they had to borrow money. And guess who they started borrowing money from? American banks. Eventually, their infrastructure, the industrial infrastructure necessary to keep churning out the weapons of war, becomes strained under the great demands of this war. Who do they start turning to? The United States. So, on paper, we're neutral. We're not taking sides, but absolutely, We were lending money to both sides, by the way, to both the Central Powers and the Triple Entente, and we were selling munitions to them. The difference, we were selling a whole lot more to the Triple Entente than we were to the Germans, and ultimately, that's going to guide this country's decision over what side to eventually side with when Woodrow Wilson finally pulls the old bait and switch and does involve the United States in the war. And that was a topic of debate. And opinion was very split in this country. Do not forget, you had millions of people in this country that were German immigrants. Either German immigrants themselves, the children of, the grandchildren of, the great-grandchildren of, going all the way back to the 1840s and even before. And they did not necessarily see Germany as the bad guy, nor did they care to entertain the prospect of possibly going to war against their fatherland. Okay, yes, born in the United States, but still very deep ethnic, cultural, linguistic ties to either their country or the country of their parents and their grandparents. And they did not necessarily see Germany. They celebrated the fact of a united Germany and a Germany trying to, claim its place in the world. But that's not who makes foreign policy in this country or domestic policy. Those are the people. But the elites, the very wealthy, those with political power, the ruling class, did not share those German roots. These were people that shared English roots. Some of these families going all the way back to the Mayflower. Okay? The actual policy makers. Okay? The folks actually with their fingers on the button, the people that owned, the economy in this country, were pretty much all English. Well, by descent at least. Had common family ties, common culture. And there's an interesting point to make about Great Britain. From the American Revolution and the War of 1812 up until this time, we did not have the best relationship with Great Britain. Did not. Britain was seen as a rival in the world to the United States. On top of that, there was still bad blood from, the American Revolution and whatnot. It begins to change here. Because the elites begin to side with the British. Why? Because we stood economically to gain more from a post-war economic relationship with the British and the French than we did having a relationship with the Germans. Frankly, Britain was in a much better position to pay off her debts, okay, and benefit the American economy than a victorious Germany would be. It was money, it was economics that directed that decision ultimately. Many people look at this event, the sinking of the Lusitania, a British passenger carrier. Here's the issue. When Woodrow Wilson was president, he named William Jennings Bryan, two-time candidate for the presidency of the United States, that populist Democrat that ran in 1896 and again in 1900 and lost to, first time he lost to William McKinley, second time he loses to Theodore Roosevelt. And once a Democrat is back in office, he makes him Secretary of State. William Jennings Bryan was very much so a Christian, very much so a Christian pacifist. And while he was Secretary of State, he was the one pushing Wilson to keep the country out of the war. There was another issue. There were still transatlantic steamers crisscrossing the ocean. On top of the fact that the North Atlantic was an open war zone, and this was announced by the British, that the British Navy and the German Navy are at war, and you proceed at your own. William Jennings Bryan wanted to close all ocean liner traffic, but Woodrow Wilson believed, no, this interferes with Americans' freedom to travel, freedom to move, and that was one of the sticking points that two men had. During Woodrow Wilson's first 4 years. So, there was notices, Hey, you want to get on the ship? That's fine. Understand it's a state of war. There are risks. The Germans, or better yet, German intelligence, um, German submarines. The only way to combat the, the great British Navy, a surface fleet that was 3 times the size of the next largest navy in the world, which was the Germans, was to fight asymmetrically. And the Germans are going to unveil a brand new asymmetrical weapon of naval warfare that's going to change the character of naval warfare, the U-boat, the undersea boat, basically what we know as the submarine. So, May 7th, 1915, the German submarine sinks the Lusitania. And of course, this is an outrage. Papers all over the country are screaming their heads off. They're telling Wilson that there's an act of war. It was a British ship, by the way, but there were Americans on board, several hundred, if I'm not mistaken, that lost their lives. Woodrow Wilson decided that, as tragic as that event was, and yes, Americans did die, it was unintentional, and it was not sufficient cause to go to war against Germany. The reason Wilson decided to do this is because Wilson knew the truth. Few people knew it at the time. The Lusitania only looked like a passenger ocean liner on the surface. In the lower decks, it was smuggling weapons to Great Britain. And German intelligence knew this, and that's why they targeted the Lusitania. And had we used the Lusitania as casus belli, as a reason to go to war against Germany, the Germans would have disclosed the fact that, listen, the Americans and the British are hiding weapons using human shields. They're hiding weapons in the bottom decks of these ocean liners, smuggling them to Great Britain, okay, endangering the lives of these passengers. And Germany can't tolerate their enemy being armed during war. And this is not the last time this happens. Yes, it's Arabic. In 1915, a British ship, a cargo ship. These are 2 cargo ships. They're not passenger liners, but they were also sunk by the Germans. And of course, discussions were made. The SS Sussex as well. We're sorry, this won't happen again. The Germans make a pledge, the Sussex pledge, I believe, that we're going to announce, that we're going to sink a ship. We appear, and and our torpedoes are aimed at. We're going to announce so they can give time for civilians, for non-combatants, to evacuate the ship. But we're not going to allow that ship to reach its destination with weapons. And even though these 2 sinkings were not as high profile as the Lusitania, in both cases, in all 3 cases, the opinion of the U.S. government was not, they were not sufficient cause to go to war against Germany. Now remember, I told you that Woodrow Wilson ran on a campaign of not getting involved, not sending American boys to die in a war in Europe. Yet, curiously enough, a number of months before he would have to run for re-election, they passed the National Defense Act. And this is strange in itself for a country that's been all this time, and during the campaign, it's going to be, no, we're not going to get into war, we're not going to get involved in the war, we're not going to get involved in the war. And yet they pass a law that actually authorizes an expansion of the United States Army and Navy, as well as grants the president power to federalize National Guard units. I think it is one of these laws that just like flew under the radar. Radars didn't exist of most people. How could the president be campaigning on a promise not to get the country involved in a war, and yet 5 months before the election, Congress is already passing by law authorizing the president to expand the Army and the Navy and to nationalize National Guard units. So the November elections happened. Woodrow Wilson's running for re-election against Republican Charles Evan Hughes. They're both pretty much running on keeping the country out of the war. The Republicans at that time were very isolationist, by the way. At that time, they would be so all through the 1920s. But Woodrow Wilson was able to successfully capitalize on many of the progressive reforms that happened during his presidency. There's a fear that, if there's a changing of the guard, if you will, the momentum behind the women's suffrage movement may not end up with a successful amendment. And so the agreement was, well, if it's pretty evident, Woodrow Wilson won a overwhelming majority of the country and a significant amount, a majority in the electoral vote. So you have to be careful with these maps because, they look overwhelmingly red, but remember, these are parts of the country that are not necessarily very well populated either. So what you need to know that Woodrow Wilson wins re-election. He's the first one since Theodore Roosevelt, which was not that long before him. And then things are going to start to change. Once he is safe and secure and wins that re-election, then things are going to start changing. Doesn't take long, folks. January 19th, 1917, within 2 months of winning that election, British intelligence, at the time, they already had transatlantic cables. If you don't know what that is, there are these huge cables that basically crisscross the ocean, allowing telegraph communications and later on radio communications, not radio, but telegraph communications to travel from continent to continent. There was a number of theirs. So you had the American cable that extended from Europe to the United States. Apparently, British intelligence, they never quite explained, why they did this, was tapping into that cable, into the American-owned cable, and apparently intercepted a message that was sent by the foreign minister of the German government to his counterpart, Mexican counterpart, a message to be delivered to the president of Mexico. This is what's called the famous Zimmermann telegram. Zimmermann was the German foreign minister that he sends this to his Mexican counterpart. This is basically what the British decipher and show the United States, a combination of numbers. Well, that's called cryptography. These numbers mean something else. But when they did decipher the cryptology, that's where you get the Zimmermann telegram. Zimmermann telegram, long story short, for time's sake, it's an offer by the German government of it's an offer by the German government to the Mexicans. If the Mexicans would, I don't know, start a war with the United States, okay? They could expect the Germans to, you could read it yourself at your leave. They could expect German support, German monetary support, German military support. And once this war is over and Germany wins and Mexico's on the winning side, Germany will push for Mexico reclaiming Texas, Arizona, California, everything she lost during the Mexican-American War. This is the last drop in the bucket. When Woodrow Wilson, and it's interesting because nobody dies from this. When Woodrow Wilson receives news of this letter, this is what he finds sufficient cause to ask the country to go to war against Germany. I imagine it's very convenient that he already won his re-election, and so he's not risking that. Yes, the Germans sent this letter and the Mexicans received it, but the Mexicans never sent a response. Because the Mexicans were not going to accept it, because the Mexicans were in no position to accept it. First of all, it was who knows if the Germans could live up to their promise of financial and military support. That was number one. That's a big gamble for the Mexicans. Number two, the Mexican government didn't even control all of Mexico. They were still very much in a state of civil war. Okay, nowhere in the position to start a war with the United States. So the Mexicans claimed, yeah, we got it. We didn't respond to it because it was kind of crazy. It was unrealistic. But despite that, Woodrow Wilson went full steam ahead with what his intentions were. And here's an image showing us the Germans whispering into the Mexican ear, the Zimmermann telegram. We're going to see a series of laws start to roll out. Congress is going to get very busy after that Zimmermann telegram. February 3rd, 1917, hearing that the United States is not very happy and pretty much getting a sense of things of what direction this is going to head into, Germany announces that she will begin unrestricted submarine warfare. That means she will target anybody that she considers a threat on the open seas. As a result, Wilson breaks diplomatic relations with Germany, but this was pretty much a done deal. Now, something that most people won't even realize, the Jones Act. Within a month, we have the infamous Jones Act. Okay, so we've spoken about this before. What are the laws that govern U.S. territories? And that goes back to a series of court cases called the Insular cases. But you also have legislation on top of that. The Jones Act was passed on the 2nd of March, 1917. And maybe it was Woodrow Wilson having the foresight to see what a challenge he was going to have in getting Americans to support this war. The Jones Act basically waved a carrot in front of Puerto Ricans who had been basically run as a colony directly by the United States since 1898. And basically Congress says, hey, Puerto Rico, how would you like to be U.S. citizens? If you're a territory of the United States, that means that, you should be extended American citizenship. There's other things with the Jones Act. I mean, it's not an absolute carrot. For example, ships from other countries, and they were doing this because the Germans are not allowed to dock in Puerto Rico to bring anything. Even that's true to today. That was a big gift to the American maritime industry. But the part that you need to know is that Puerto Ricans gained American citizenship by law on the 2nd of March, 1917 with the Jones Act. There's more to the Jones Act. That's the part that I want you to remember because, with citizenship also comes obligations and responsibilities. About a month later, on the 6th of April, Woodrow Wilson makes it formal. He goes to Congress and he asks for Congress for a declaration of war against the German Empire. Remember, there had been no declaration of war in this country. Wow, I wouldn't even think the Civil War. I'm not sure the Civil War was an officially declared war against the Confederate States of America. But for declaration of war. Oh, I'm sorry, from Spain. So this country had not declared war against anybody since 1898, since Spain. There you have it. There went the promises of keeping the country out of the war. It didn't take long. Now that the country was at war, here's the second challenge. There's not much of an appetite for war in this country. Most people were pretty isolationist on the matter. It's a European war. They didn't want to get involved in it. So now he has to convince millions of men to feel otherwise. You think about it, about 100 years ago, mass communications. What did they have at their disposal? This is before social networking, before televisions, even before radio. It was print. Print was what you turned to. And Woodrow Wilson turned towards an advertising guy, George Creel. And he said, listen, I need your help. I need your help mustering support for this war. George Creel is going to take command of, they call it the Committee on Public Information. And the Committee of Public Information is going to create some of the most iconic wartime posters wartime propaganda that this country has ever seen. That's a very famous image, by the way, and it touches so many of the buttons that effective, modern day propaganda uses. Showing the enemy to be an animal. That women are in distress and they require to be saved, etc., etc. George Creel also trained an army of men whose job was to travel around the country, to go to churches, to go to baseball games, to go to public venues, and give these scripted minutes, I think like 5 or 10 minute long speeches as to why we should support the war, why we should go to war, why should we go and volunteer go to the war. But here's the fact of the matter: nobody was volunteering. Okay, he gets his declaration of war, and frankly, he's going to need millions of men, and they're just not showing up. They don't want to show up. That's great, Mr. Wilson. You got your war, but your job of convincing the American people, American men, to give everything behind to go fight this war in Europe, which is not really clear how the United States benefits from this. Well, that's going to be a tough one for Woodrow Wilson. So here's some more of the images that the Committee on Public Information created. And all sides were doing these. World War One and World War Two were great for wartime poster propaganda. It was the golden age of the propaganda poster. Well, now he needs money for a war. Wars, military spending was not funded the way that it's funded today. It doesn't come out of a general pot of money, okay, this is defense spending. Um, the law that they gave him the year prior allowed him, the money to expand, allowed him to expand the Army and the Navy. Now he needs to get that money together. And the way wars were funded, World War One and World War Two, was through the sale of bonds, meaning that investors would purchase bonds. These are IOUs. The investors would lend the government money. Individual investors, large investors would lend the government money, and the government would use this money to go to war, with the promise that at some point in the future, you could cash in these bonds and get your money back plus interest. So selling Liberty bonds, selling Liberty bonds, selling Liberty bonds were instrumental in financing this war, okay? Because wars were financed a little bit different back then than they were today. So a lot of the propaganda posters were also centered around the idea of buying Liberty bonds. And what Wilson doesn't like is criticism, because not everybody buys his version or George Creel's version of why Americans should go fight in Europe. These are still very radical years. Okay, there are still very deep divisions in American society. A lot of it is rooted in the conflict between labor and capital in this country. Okay, and there are people that are openly criticizing um, the war. He has two problems. Not enough people are showing up, and too many people are openly criticizing the American entry into the war. To solve the issue of not that many people showing up, Congress passes the Selective Service Act, which exists to this day. Passed on May 18th, 1917, it obligates every American male at the age of 18 to register, to put your name on a national register. If the country would ever go to war, they have your name, etc., etc. The Selective Service Act, when it was passed in 1917, allowed the Wilson administration to enact the second draft this country has ever known. The only way he was able to get enough bodies to go to Europe and fight this war was through a draft. He was never going to accomplish it through volunteers alone. Mind you, the first time this country ever went to a draft was in 1864, at the deepest depths of the Civil War, in which the country was facing a real existential crisis. The very future of the country hung in the balance. This was not a scenario anything like 1864. And yet, President Wilson convinces Congress to pass the second draft this country had ever known. And now we're going to force millions of men to go and fight a war in Europe, many of these men not wishing to do so. And then, to shut everybody up, the Sedition Act and the Espionage Act. Two laws that did so much damage to the freedom of speech in this country. The Sedition Act was actually an expansion of the Espionage Act. Let's talk about the Espionage Act first. The Espionage Act made it illegal to interfere with the war effort, disrupt recruitment, or render aid to an enemy nation. And that last one is a problem because, anything could be seen. Criticizing the war could be seen as, hey, you're helping the enemy. The Sedition Act, which was passed as an expansion of the Espionage Act, went even further. It criminalized any expressions of opinion that were critical of the government, critical of the war plan, of the war effort, or interfered with the sale of liberty bonds. So you have this complete chilling of civil liberties in this country by the Woodrow administration and the Congress at that time. They make it a crime to criticize the government. They make it a crime to criticize the war. They make it a crime to dissuade people from buying liberty bonds. Okay. And they make it a crime in the court's interpretation of interfering with the war effort or recruitment. A number of famous people were charged under the Espionage Act. Eugene Debs, for example. Eugene Debs went to go visit three socialist friends that were in prison, charged with violating the Sedition Act. And I'm going to put a link at the speech that he gave. After he visited his friends, he stands across the street and he gives a speech to a number of followers. And as soon as the speech is over, he's arrested. He is going to be found guilty of violating the Espionage Act, and he's going to get a 10-year sentence. He appeals. It even goes all the way to the Supreme Court, Debs versus the United States in 1919. And the Supreme Court upholds the lower court decision. And the sentence of 10 years for speaking against the war, of discouraging men to go and fight in a war that has nothing to do with them, carries a 10-year sentence. It wasn't just Debs. Victor Berger, a socialist congressman, was found guilty under the Espionage Act. Emma Goldman, another labor activist. Here's an interesting one. Joseph Franklin Rutherford, not the founder, but the second president of what one day would be called the Jehovah's Witnesses. He is also convicted of the espionage. Of all the people that were convicted of the espionage, the only one that won their case on appeal was Joseph Franklin Rutherford. So yes, dark days for civil liberties in this country. Even the suffragettes had to be very wary of, how do you protest on behalf of women's rights and the women's right to vote and not have somebody come and twist and turn your words and interpret it as somehow you're interfering with the war effort. So, by the way, the Espionage Act is still on the books. The Sedition Act, which was broader, was worse, was repealed in 1920. But the Espionage Act is still on the books, although it may not be enforced as recklessly as it was at one time. Woodrow Wilson had to convince industry to forget what they were making and make munitions, make weapons of war. That means American people had to accept sacrifices. Paper recycling was an initiative. Tin cans. People were encouraged to turn in their tin cans to the government to recycle, to be used for the war. August 19th, we set up the Food Administration. Meatless Mondays. wheatless Wednesdays. Americans should not eat meat on Mondays, should not eat wheat-based product on Wednesdays. Why? Because we need those items to send to the front, to send to our allies in Europe, and to send to our boys that are fighting in the trenches. So even the American diet was affected during this war. And then unfortunately, it always happens, right? We're at war with Germany, and this is what a lot of German Americans were afraid of. And so you ask this question, it's like, wow, mister, you've always told us that there's this huge community of German Americans, German American immigrants in this country, numbered in the millions throughout the Midwest. And, if I don't see them. I mean, you don't see them. Well, they're there. They're there. And there's very good reasons why they disappeared. They took steps deliberately to disappear. If you find yourself in a situation that all of a sudden your heritage, your language, your last name brings negative attention, there were a few people that were actually, German Americans, were actually lynched in the early years of World War One. And then less intelligent folks started trying to label all things German as being, associated with the enemy. I mean, the American media is very good at getting Americans to hate one particular group or one particular country at a particular time because it fits the foreign policy objectives of that particular moment. So what did Germans do? They changed their last names. They stopped speaking German. They took down the German street signs and they replaced them with English. They stopped teaching German in schools. They closed down the German American clubs. They Americanized incredibly quickly, if anything, so as to avoid negative attention from the general population. Datsuns were renamed Wiener Dogs. Hot dogs were renamed Liberty Sausages. Sauerkraut was renamed Liberty Cabbage. And we saw a lot of this silliness at the beginning of the war with Iraq as well. And little by little, the fingerprints that the German immigrant experience had put all over this country began to disappear. And they even changed their last names. Smiths became Schmidt. Muellers became Miller. And all this was done to fly under the radar, if you will. And off we go. Once Woodrow Wilson gets the money and the materials and the men, off we go to Europe. We go. We have to cross the Atlantic Ocean. How are you going to send millions of men and materials across the Atlantic Ocean when there are very dangerous German U-boats prowling the ocean, now targeting not just American ships, not just British ships, but American ships as well? And the way we resolved that, we resolved that challenge was by using the convoy. And the convoy is very simple: travel in groups, and a submarine is going to be less willing to pop its head up and attack any one of the ships. The man that's sent at the head of the American Expeditionary Force is none other than John J. Pershing, long distinguished career, commander of troops during the Indian Wars, marched alongside Teddy Roosevelt at the Battle of, not Bunker Hill, the Battle of San Juan Hill in Cuba, was sent into Mexico to find Pancho Villa, and then recalled so that he could lead American troops into Europe in World War I. One of the most notable things that when Pershing arrives in France, because that's where American troops are going to pour into, he goes and he visits the tomb of the Marquis de Lafayette. If you guys don't know who that was, Lafayette was the French nobleman that assisted George Washington in his struggle to liberate British North America from British rule. This was very much seen as, and now we're here because we owe a debt to the French. And he goes to the tomb of Lafayette and he lays a wreath of flowers and he says, Lafayette, we are here. We're here to repay this debt that we owe you. So I don't know if that's apocryphal or actually factual, but I think it's a nice story nonetheless. There was disagreements with the French command. That's great that you Americans showed up here in June finally with your brand new boots and brand new weapons and pockets full of cash and guns that have never been fired in anger. But you see, our boys have been in the trenches since 1914, battle hardened. If we throw very gung ho but inexperienced American boys at the front, it's going to be a bloodbath. So, the only way that we would allow Americans to enter the trenches at this point is if they serve under French commanders. And Pershing was not having that. Under no circumstances are American troops going to serve under French commanders. They'll serve under American commanders. And so they made a deal. Okay, fine. Then you won't be at the front. So here's another fun fact a lot of people don't know. Yes, American troops began arriving in June. American troops would not involve themselves in combat, would not be allowed to advance to the front until May of 1918. From June of 1917 to May of 1918, American troops in France were there as support personnel. The French and the British refused to allow American troops to advance to the front lines for fear that it would be a liability to the troops already there. There were exceptions, however. The American Expeditionary Force was made up of 3.5 million draftees because of the Selective Service Act of 1917, plus 1.5 million volunteers. That tells you right there that the vast majority of these people had to be drafted because they didn't want to go. And over half of these 5 million would end up in France. Before the year was over, when 1917 was over, 84,000 trained and equipped U.S. troops would be in France. More would follow at a rate of 10,000 a day. And here are pictures of the infamous American Doughboys. This is the first war in which the United States Army abandons the traditional continental blue uniform in any way, shape, or form and adopts what the British, it's basically a British uniform, adopts khaki. Okay? Because modern armies finally got it. Hey, maybe you should make an effort to try to blend in with your surroundings. What's the color of the dirt? Hey, let's have a uniform that more or less the same color of the dirt. That's where khaki comes from. And the infamous wide brim, not the infamous, the famous wide brim doughboy helmet, which was multi-purpose. It was made out of steel. It did not just protect your head if you were lucky, but could also be used to wash or cook it. I told you there were exceptions. Woodrow Wilson was no friend of African Americans. We've said this before. In fact, when he took office, he changed policy that had existed since the Civil War and prohibited African Americans from serving in combat capacity, in combat roles. The only troops that were allowed to take, the only American troops that were allowed to take to the front, and that meant serving under French commanders, were African American troops. Unfortunately, white American commanders were more than happy to let them go. And so we basically gave all of our African American troops to the French. Yeah, take them, whatever. And over 250,000 African American soldiers would serve on the Western Front. Out of a total expeditionary force of 5 million, 250,000 were African American and fought with distinction and were decorated and recognized by the French army. And a good number of them are either going to stay or come back to the United States and then return to France. The French experience for African Americans ends up being very instrumental, very important in the shaping of the African American consciousness moving into the 20th century. So that's a picture of the Harlem Hellfighters. They all fought under French commanders. Aerial photograph of no man's land. If the Western Front was known for anything, it was known for the static nature of the warfare. Enemies, both sides dug trenches that reached from the English Channel all the way to the coast of Switzerland, all across, to the border of Switzerland, all across northern France. And it was a game of inches. Okay, you had your front line trenches, and everywhere between was a no man's land. And life in the trenches was not easy. Men, not only was there the constant threat of being mobilized into a charge over your trench and across no man's land, in which the vast majority of your fellow soldiers would most likely die, and the commanders were okay with this. Um, Dysentery, fleas, lice, trench foot. It would rain. The muddy floor of the trenches would get flooded. Water would seep into your boot, and before you know it, you got a really nasty case of athlete's foot to the point that you could barely even walk. That's where they got the word a trench foot from. And then the psychological problem of just being exposed to the very real reality that at any moment you could die. That at any moment enemy shell could land into your trench and bury everybody alive. And that happened all too many times. Chemical warfare made its debut in World War I. All sides used it, and that made the war even more terrible. Okay, the enemy could release poison gas canisters in the direction of your trench, and before you know it, people are choking to death. Um, Here's a look at some of the common gases that were used during World War I. This weapon was so insidious, so heinous that it's actually a war crime today. It's been banned ever since. Mustard gas is extremely irritant if it is breathed in through your nose or your mouth. It causes extreme swelling to the point that it actually constricts the airways and you suffocate. If somehow you get it in the tissue that lines the inside of your eye socket, it will swell up your eye to the point that you'll be temporarily blinded. Chlorine gas was even deadlier, so feel free to pause and read the details of that particular slide. Weapons got deadlier too. The Maxim machine gun. This is the problem. Now you have machine gun nests that are spitting thousands of rounds a minute um, downfield. Okay, it is impractical. It is deadly. You just this is the end of warfare had it existed before. This is why people had to take precautions, the likes of which nobody took before in warfare. The British rolled out the tank, the early tanks, and the Germans rolled out the U-boats. And then the airplane, a rather recent invention, quickly weaponized by the United States Army, also made its debut in World War I. At first, the airplane is used as reconnaissance. That means to gather information about the enemy lines. The Zeppelin, which is a German innovation, allowed for even higher altitude reconnaissance of the enemy. Eventually, they will be strapped with bombs and machine guns and modern um, air warfare is born in World War I.